In a quiet house filled with memories of her late husband, a woman tries to keep her days peaceful, until two guests turn her life into something darker. Her son's wife and the woman's overbearing mother move in, bringing smiles too polished and kindness too rehearsed. At first, it's small things: her mail opened, her medicine reorganized, her belongings rearranged. She tells herself she's imagining it, until one morning a cup of hot chocolate changes everything. Smells sweet, but something's wrong. Beneath the cocoa and cinnamon, there's a sharp, bitter trace, a smell too close to metal and fear. She doesn't drink. Instead, she calmly switches the cups. Minutes later, one of them collapses, shaking, gasping, foam at her lips. While the younger woman screams for help, the old mother stands still, her hand steady as she dials for an ambulance. My daughter-in-law's mother has been poisoned. The truth unravels fast. What was meant to silence her, to make her appear confused, unstable, ready for a care home, now turns into a crime scene. Through calm words and quiet strength, she tells the detective every detail. The bottle of hidden pills, the switched cups, the long months of manipulation disguised as help. When it's all over, she returns to her empty home. The same kitchen, the same blue-rimmed cup she once feared to touch. But this time, it's filled only with coffee and peace. And as she writes the truth in her notebook, date by date, detail by detail, she realizes something chilling yet liberating. They thought I was fragile. They forgot I was watching. I woke before dawn as always. I suppose it's habit, or maybe I just get along with silent hours. The house was dark, except for the soft glow of the stove clock, blinking 5:17 in a steady rhythm. I filled the kettle, set it on the flame, and rested my hands on the counter while waiting for the water to begin trembling and hissing. It's been 12 years since Isaac left, and I still half expect to hear his boots at the door, the scrape of his jacket, his voice calling me by name. Paula. That thought pulled a smile from me, though the pain by now is an old acquaintance, something I've learned to carry. When the kettle whistled, I poured the water over my tea bag and sat at the kitchen table. Through the window fogged by the cold, I saw my rose bushes bowed under the weight of last night's frost. I should have covered them. Another thing I let slip. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs, light, precise. Not Eli's heavy stride. Simone appeared in the doorway, already dressed, wearing a soft gray sweater and pale pink lipstick, like a peach blossom. As always, she looked ready for an audience. "You're up early," I said, forcing my voice into calmness. She smiled, and something in that smile made my skin prickle. "I thought you might like something warm," she said, stepping toward the counter with movements too measured, almost choreographed. I watched her take the blue-rimmed cup I keep in the cabinet for special occasions. Isaac gave me that set on our 3rd anniversary. I hadn't used it in years. Simone poured hot chocolate from a small pot, stirred it, then placed it in front of me. "I know you've been tired lately," she said, smoothing the napkin beside it. "You deserve a little treat." Her eyes lingered on me, waiting for a reaction. I looked at the cup. A ribbon of steam rose from the surface, carrying the sweet, deep scent of cocoa. For a moment, I almost let myself feel grateful, but then I inhaled again, deeper this time, and the sweetness shifted. It mixed with something sharp, wrong. I didn't move. Simone tilted her head, watching me with that polished calm that felt like a second skin. "I'll let you enjoy it," she said, and walked down the hall. I waited until her steps faded. Then I leaned closer to the cup, letting the smell rise. There it was, that bitter note under the sugar. I didn't touch the cup. I sat perfectly still, watching the steam fade away. The scent reminded me of something I couldn't name, like the faint metallic tang in the air when Isaac was restoring the cedar trunk in the attic. Chemical, almost antiseptic. I pressed my palm against the table to steady myself. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe my mind was inventing danger where there was none. But unease crawled up my arms like a whisper under my skin. Then I heard shuffling footsteps in the hallway. Florence, before she appeared. She paused in the doorway, blinking as if surprised to see me there. Her eyes flicked from the cup to my face. "Don't let it get cold," she said flatly, voice dry as old paper. I nodded but said nothing. She stood there, her gaze sweeping the kitchen with that familiar disapproval. They'd only been here 6 months, but it already felt like the house had shifted to fit them. Every cabinet reorganized. Every familiar thing moved, or quietly vanished. Even my routine seemed to offend them. Florence cleared her throat. "Simone says you haven't been sleeping well." "I sleep perfectly," I replied, keeping my voice steady. She studied me, her expression unreadable. For a moment, I wondered if she knew exactly what was in that cup. Maybe she did. Or maybe she simply didn't care. When she turned away, I let out a trembling breath. My hands were cold. I reached for the cup, but stopped before touching the handle. I remembered the bottle in the pantry. White label, small letters I had to squint to read in the dim light. Diazepam, 60 tablets. Prescribed to no one in this house. I had tucked it behind the flower and said nothing. Eli would say I was imagining things. Too proud to accept help. But this wasn't help. This was something else. Something I could no longer pretend not to see. I stood, taking the cup carefully, and went upstairs. Each step felt deliberate, rehearsed. In my bedroom, I set the cup on the dresser and sat in my armchair, heart pounding so hard I felt it in my throat. I leaned forward and smelled again just to be sure. The bitterness hadn't gone. I stayed there for a long time, the cup untouched between us. A quiet challenge. Morning light slid across the floor, pale and cold, bright enough to show every stain on the glass, every fine crack in the varnish of Isaac's dresser. Funny, the things you notice when you're trying not to think about something else. I tried to remember when everything began to twist. Maybe it was January, when Simone offered to help me with my prescriptions. She'd smiled then too, that careful smile that never reached her eyes. Said it was practical, that it would save me the trouble. I refused, polite but firm. She'd seemed almost disappointed. Or maybe it was that afternoon in March, when I walked into the kitchen and found Florence going through my mail. She hadn't even looked ashamed. Folded the electric bill neatly in half and set it aside, as if it were hers. Each small violation so easy to ignore. Kind gesture. A misunderstanding. A simple oversight. But now I could see the pattern, clear as glass. I thought of Eli, how he'd shake his head and say I was too stubborn to accept help, too proud to admit I was alone. Maybe I was. But loneliness was easier to bear than suspicion, at least until now. I lifted the cup again, not to drink but to be sure. The bitterness stung my nose, unmistakable. Not chocolate. Not cinnamon. Something cutting wrong. My throat tightened. Downstairs I heard voices. Simone and Florence speaking in the kitchen, their tones too soft to make out. My name rose once in the silence, then faded. I set the cup back on the dresser and folded my hands in my lap. The choice was clear. I could drink, pretend to trust them, pretend not to feel what I felt, or I could act. I took a deep breath, stood, and reached for the door. I went downstairs, the cup steady in my hands. The kitchen went silent as I entered. Simone turned first, her expression transforming into something bright and practiced. Florence looked from me to the cup, then away, studying the linoleum pattern as if it held answers. "I thought you'd finished," Simone said, her voice a little too light. "I wasn't thirsty," I replied. My own voice sounded strange. Distant even. I walked to the table where another cup waited, Florence's. Steam still curled from it, sweet and rich, the scent I'd always associated with winter mornings and simpler times. I stared at it for a moment, feeling that familiar ache behind my ribs. I didn't want to believe what I believed. I wanted to be wrong. I picked up Florence's cup. My fingers were steady, my face calm. I could feel their eyes on me, that careful attention that said more than any accusation. I turned, walked to the counter, and set the cup I had brought beside the other. The handles faced opposite directions now, one slightly chipped, the other intact. To anyone else it would mean nothing. But I'd remember. When I turned back, Simone's mouth opened, as if to speak, but she didn't. Neither of them did. I breathed slowly and lifted the clean cup, the one that didn't smell like poison. I turned toward Florence, whose hands had begun to fidget in her lap. "You look tired," I said softly, the way you'd speak to a stranger on a bad day. "Would you like some hot chocolate? No need to waste it." Her gaze darted toward Simone, as if seeking silent permission. Simone didn't move. Didn't even blink. "I suppose," Florence murmured. Finally, I set the cup in front of her and watched as her thin fingers closed around it. I went back to my seat and placed my hands on the table, palms flat against the worn wood, and waited. The seconds after she took her first sip stretched like a taut thread. I watched her mouth as she swallowed, the movement of her throat, the way her eyes closed as if savoring the taste. Simone exhaled, her shoulders lowering just slightly, but her gaze slid toward me, quick and searching. I didn't look away. Florence set the cup down and cleared her throat. "It's very good," she said softly. "Delicious." "I'm glad," I murmured. I folded my hands in my lap so they wouldn't tremble. For a moment no one spoke. The radiator knocked softly behind us, the only sound in the kitchen. Simone's hand crept toward the edge of the table, her fingers tapping an uneven rhythm. I thought of all the time she had sat across from me, her face tilted in polite concern, asking whether I was sure I hadn't misplaced something, whether I was sure I'd taken my medicine. How quickly that kindness had soured. Florence took another sip, this one longer. When she set the cup down, her fingers shook just slightly. Simone noticed at the same time I did. Her eyes widened, then flicked to me. "Mom?" she asked, her voice tight. Florence didn't answer right away. She pressed her lips together, blinked several times. Her breath came out in a short gasp. "I feel," she began, but her voice broke. She lifted a trembling hand to her forehead. Simone shoved her chair back with a screech and came around the table. She knelt beside her mother, pressing her palm against her cheek. "Look at me," she said louder. "Look at me." Florence's eyes were glassy, unfocused. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her hand slipped from her forehead, striking the cup, spilling chocolate in a slow brown arc that dripped to the floor. Simone's breathing turned ragged. She gripped Florence's shoulder, shaking her once, twice. "Stay with me." I didn't move. My hand stayed flat against the table, warm with memory. Florence tried to swallow, but her jaw locked. A thin string of foam slid between her lips. Simone let out a sound I'd never heard, something between a sob and a gasp, and turned toward me, her face contorted. I held her gaze, and for the first time she looked away. Simone's hands were slick with spilled chocolate as she tried to support Florence, whispering her name like a prayer again and again, her voice unraveling. I didn't rise. I sat in my chair and watched. Florence's head tilted to one side. A tremor ran through her body, and then she went still, her breathing shallow, uneven. "Call someone," Simone screamed, not looking at me. "Do something." I reached for the phone on the sideboard, my fingers finding the worn buttons. I pressed each one slowly, deliberately. My heartbeat was steady, as if I'd been preparing for this moment. When the operator answered, I spoke calmly. "I need an ambulance," I said. "My daughter-in-law's mother isn't responding. She's been poisoned." Simone's head jerked up at that word. "Don't say that," she hissed. "Don't you dare say that." I met her eyes. "What else would you call it?" Her face twisted, a flash of something fierce cutting through her expression. "You did this," she spat. "You wanted to humiliate us. You wanted." "She drank what you prepared for me," I said, my voice steady. "If you believed it was safe, then you have nothing to worry about." Simone's mouth opened and closed. She pressed both palms to her forehead as if trying to hold her head together. "It wasn't supposed to be her," she whispered finally. I said nothing. The operator's voice crackled in my ear, asking for details. And I gave them with the measured composure I'd used my whole life. At the library counter, at Isaac's hospital bedside. In every moment when someone needed me to stay calm. When I hung up, Simone was crouched beside Florence, rocking back and forth, fists clenched. She was only trying to help me, she said hoarsely. You don't understand how hard it's been. The debts, the pressure, you have no idea. I have more of an idea than you think, I replied. The sirens sounded in the distance, a faint wail that grew with every heartbeat. Simone buried her face against her mother's shoulder, her whole body trembling. I stood from my chair and stepped aside, my hand resting for a moment on the backrest before letting go. The paramedics swept past me, a blur of blue uniforms and sharp questions. I watched them check Florence's pulse, tilt her chin back, place an oxygen mask over her face. Simone stayed crouched beside them, her hands twisting the hem of her sweater. I moved aside to give them room. My body felt lighter than it should, as if a knot had finally loosened. Eli appeared in the doorway, hair disheveled, eyes wide with fear that broke my heart. He took in the scene, the overturned chair, the brown stain spreading across the floor, Simone clutching her mother. Then he looked at me. What happened? He whispered. I thought of all the ways I could soften it, but I had no softness left. She drank the chocolate that was meant for me, I said. Simone let out a broken sound. Eli's gaze flicked between us. He took a step toward me, then stopped, as if he'd hit something invisible. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the folded receipts I'd saved. The photos I'd taken of the pill bottle. I handed them to him without a word. His hand trembled as he took them. He didn't look up again. The paramedics lifted Florence onto the stretcher. The wheels rattled across the threshold as they carried her outside toward the ambulance. Simone tried to follow, but Eli caught her arm. She didn't resist. I watched them go together, his hand still gripping her elbow. When the door closed, the house fell silent again. I stood there, listening to my own breathing steady. Detective Salazar arrived just after noon. She was younger than I expected, with a careful way of speaking that reminded me of the librarians I'd trained back when I still worked. She introduced herself, though I already knew her name from the neighbors' chatter. I led her to the kitchen, still faintly smelling of chocolate and something unpleasant underneath. She asked if I minded her recording our conversation. I told her I didn't. Not at all. She began with simple questions. When did Simone move in? When did Florence arrive? Had there been any tension? I answered each one carefully. I told her about the little things. The reorganized mail, the medicine cabinet rearranged without my permission, the bottle of diazepam hidden behind the flower. When I described the chocolate and the bitterness I'd smelled, she didn't interrupt, only nodded, her pen moving steadily across a spiral notebook. Simone came back once during the interview. She stopped in the doorway, pale, and tried to speak. Detective Salazar raised a hand to stop her. I'd like to finish with Paula first, she said evenly. Simone's eyes met mine. For a moment I thought she might beg, but she only swallowed hard and withdrew into the hall. I waited until her footsteps faded before continuing. I described how I'd switched the cups, how I'd watched Florence drink. My voice stayed calm. It was easier than I'd imagined. When I finished, Detective Salazar closed her notebook. She didn't smile, but there was something almost respectful in her expression. She told me she would need the cups as evidence. I nodded and stepped aside to let her collect them. 2 days later, the phone rang while I was folding laundry in the living room. The detective's voice was steady but certain. Toxicology confirmed what we all suspected, she said. Enough sedatives to do far worse, if you had been the one to drink it. Florence was still unconscious at the hospital. They didn't know if she would wake up. After hanging up, I sat with one hand pressed against the warm cotton of Isaac's old shirts. For a moment, I allowed myself only one feeling. Exhaustion. Not fear. Not anger. Just the kind of tiredness that settles deep in the bones. Eli came that night. He didn't bring Simone. He looked older than he had 2 days before. His face drawn, his shoulders slumped. When I opened the door, he didn't step inside right away. Finally, he lifted his head and looked at me. "I don't know how we got here," he said. I thought of all the small choices that had added up to this moment. The mail, the pills, the cup. It was never just one thing. It was everything. "You don't have to understand it," I said. "But you can't pretend it didn't happen." He nodded, his throat moving. He came in and sat at the table where Florence had collapsed. I served black coffee. No sugar to hide anything. We didn't talk for a long time. When he finally stood to leave, he looked at me as if he wanted to say something more. But instead he pressed his palm against the doorframe and left without another word. I closed the door behind him and stood there a while, listening to the house breathe around me. 6 months have passed. The house has fallen back into its old rhythms. I sweep the kitchen every morning, sort the mail myself, and brew coffee in the blue-rimmed cup I once feared to lift. No one comes to move my things or question my memory. No one suggests I'm losing my mind. Simone pled guilty to a lesser charge. The newspapers called it a tragic misunderstanding. They didn't print anything about the pill bottle or the receipts. They didn't care that it hadn't been an accident. Eli moved to Querétaro after the sentencing. I heard he rents a small apartment near his company's offices. He sent a letter of apology, without using the word. I read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it in the drawer where I keep the old things I'm not ready to throw away. I began to write everything down. Filled a notebook with dates, notes, memories. A record that couldn't be denied by words. When the pages were full, I started another. And another. I don't know if anyone will ever read them. But it comforts me to see the truth written in my own hand. Detective Salazar stops by from time to time. She never stays long. Just long enough to make sure I'm all right. That the silence hasn't grown heavy again. She always brings a small bag of coffee beans from the cafe on the corner of the plaza. We share a cup, sitting at the same table where so much ended. And I feel something close to peace. Today, after she left, I poured a second cup and took it out to the garden. The rose bushes Isaac planted have bloomed again, stronger than they look. I drank my coffee and let the warmth settle in my chest. I was still here, still standing, stronger than anyone ever imagined.